First of all, I want to, my heartfelt thanks for being invited to be part of this. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk about immigration and to see what my colleagues here are doing. On a personal level, it's nice to have the opportunity to escape from New York and the United States for a few minutes to escape the turbulent political election. And it's actually related to what I'm going to talk about because Donald Trump's grandfather left Germany in 1885, and he went to a neighborhood that was then called Klein Deutschland. I know you're going to say Little Germany, but I don't need to say that. He came to, and Klein Deutschland is now the Lower East Side. So his grandfather, who worked as a barber, lived just 2 blocks away from the building I'm going to be talking about today. So if you see him, please tell him to visit our museum so we can teach him more about immigration. But today, I'm going to tell you very briefly about our buildings and both what we've been doing for the last 25 years, and we're now at a moment where we're going to be embarking on a new project and interpreting the building on your right. But this building here, 97 Orchard Street, is one that the museum started with. And the dream of the founders of the museum was to tell the story of immigration beyond Ellis Island. In other words, beyond simply arriving. There's a museum, Ellis Island, where you can see the place where many immigrants, about 13 million, I think, or 12 million between 1892 and 1954 arrived. But the story of the real drama in immigration is not just arriving, but it's what happens the day after, the week after, the month after, the years after, and what happens in families and what happens in neighborhoods. And that was what they wanted to do, and they wanted to do it in a way that was different from most museum experiences. Most museums in the United States have wall text or audio guides. And most museums talk about art, or they talk about science. And even our historic sites, our historic houses, which focus on people and history, tend to focus on famous people, inventors, politicians, writers, where our museum is really about ordinary people. And it really springs from the movement in social history in the 1960s and 1970s. But what we do at this museum is tell the stories of people who lived in this building, immigrants who came in the early years. The building opened in 1863 by a German tailor named Lucas Glockner, who decided to go into real estate and built this building. Over the years, it was open for residents between 1863 and 1935. So in the early years, it's mostly German-speaking immigrants, a few Irish families. As the decades move on into the 1880s and 1890s, you have waves of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jewish immigrants, and Italian immigrants after around 1910. And those are the main waves of migration we've discussed in this building. Our mission statement is one that I can't memorize, so I put it up for you to read. But my department has kind of come up with our one-sentence mission, which is to elevate the stories of ordinary people to inspire connections, past and present. This is the hallway of 97 Orchard Street, and I'm going to divide my talk first by talking about the stories we've told in this building, and then I'll talk about our new building, which takes us into the 20th century. And this is the hallway. So many people begin their tour in this hallway, and all of our tours are led by educators. So you can't walk around with an audio guide. You have to be with a person. And what it means is that you're traveling in small groups of 15 people through the building, hearing the stories. And I think that gives us remarkable flexibility in that we can respond to the questions that our visitors have, and in turn we take the responses that the visitors have and we sometimes shape our tour content around that as well. That's one of the things I love about working at this museum, is how responsive we can be to the people who are visiting us, whether they are school children, whether they are tourists from Texas or they're tourists from Berlin. We're able to kind of respond to what we're hearing. And then I think on another level, what I love is that people are learning from each other as well in these small groups. It's very rare now in my country for strangers to have a space to have a conversation, and so that's one of the things I enjoy about this museum. Just in terms of some history, this is actually from a museum exhibit, not quite a museum exhibit, but an exhibit in 1900, where reformers, part of the progressive movement, who wanted to make the case that the city, that the government had more responsibility for improving the lives of working class people who lived in such crowded tenements, basically created an exhibit at an uptown site, a nice neighborhood. They brought the Lower East Side, which was the most crowded neighborhood in the world at the time. They brought the conditions to this uptown site so that upper class people could see what the environment was like, and they did this in order to inspire change. And so this is a block, one block on the Lower East Side that had about 2,781 people living in it, very few bathrooms, so that you get a sense of the conditions. And the exhibit was also augmented with many photographs from a famous photographer, journalist of the time, Jacob Riis. And this was done to promote a law. So there, even in this hallway, as we talk about the families who lived here, we use the space as points of departure to talk about the broader movements in the city and in the country at the time. Because the law that was passed from that exhibit brought lighting and brought plumbing to this building. So people experience that viscerally in that space. And this is simply the layout of a tenement, a typical tenement apartment in our building. It's about 325 square feet, or 32 square meters. And it's typically a kitchen, a bedroom, and a parlor. But by 1900, all the rooms in these apartments would be used as bedrooms because there were so many people living in these spaces. In 1900, average of 6 people per space, but there were many apartments that had 10 or 12 people sharing the space. So this is what the building looked like when the founders came to it in the 1980s. No one had lived in the building for approximately 50 years. So the building was in a state of disrepair. But the founders were very much attracted to what they saw here in the sense of the layers of the building. And these are just some examples of linoleum, a floor covering, wallpaper, paint, because the layers speak to the different families who lived in those spaces. And so to be able to at once give people a sense of what an individual family experienced, but at the same time to talk about all the waves of people that came through any one of these apartments. About 7,000 people lived in the building between 1863 and 1935. And then also I should add that about 220,000 people visit our museum, which is a little bit crazy considering it's such a small space, which is one of the reasons why we're expanding. And these are just some of the artisans who work in the building, tracing the paint layers and kind of figuring out how we know what we know about the space, so that when we restore an apartment to a particular time period, we're doing it using the right paint color, the right wallpapers, and so on. And then to this point, we also have a tour that focuses on that interpretation and architecture that's offered once a week, because there are some people who just, this stuff is what they really, really love. And I love that too, but I love even more the stories. And so the first store in all tenements that were built in Klein-Deutschland, and in most cases, most buildings built in New York have on the first floor commerce, space for commerce. And our building had a locale, a Lagerbeer Saloon. And I don't have to translate that, that's wonderful. And you can see actually on the left, your right, a map of Klein-Deutschland, and all of the dots and squares are for saloons, the Lagerbeer saloons. And they were everywhere. And actually the headline, I don't think it's on here, it says where Lager reigns, where Lager rules. And now, Walt Whitman, a New York poet, one of the greatest poets, visited the Lagerbeer saloons and wrote about them and talked about them as being a place for community. But there were other New Yorkers who looked at maps like this and thought, these Germans are crazy. What are they doing to our city? They're bringing, not only it's not just that they're bringing beer, but in the spaces where they serve beer, women and children are there. And this was considered shocking in some circles. So what we do on this tour is we talk about the kind of the perceptions of people from beyond, and then the contrast between what is going on in these spaces, and that these were in many cases living rooms for the community. This is the announcement in the New Yorker Stadtzeitung, which is actually the third most popular newspaper in New York, because New York was the third largest German-speaking city at the time due to all the immigration from German-speaking lands. And Klein-Deutschland, our neighborhood, just taken alone, was the fifth largest German-speaking city. And this is the announcement of John Schneider and his wife Caroline Schneider opening up their beer saloon. And what's very nice is that often on our tours we have visitors from Germany who will volunteer to read this out loud to everyone else. But then at first they see the font and the script, but they make it through. But for us, a clip like this, which would have been discarded by John and Caroline Schneider a week or two after it appeared in the paper, to us, when we find this is like a prayer for us. This is so exciting because this is such a link to the world that they had, and so that we kind of invoke this as a prayer 7 or 8 times a day as the various tours go through, because this gives us a kind of window onto this space at the time, and it's been recreated to be that saloon, and we talk about all the issues that happened. It's hard to see in this picture, but in the back you can see an interior staircase, and that became very important because as a result of the there were reformers who didn't like the fact that beer was sold on Sunday, or that any alcohol was sold on Sunday. So they created laws that required saloon keepers to close on Sundays. And we saw that John Schneider, our saloon keeper, had actually signed something saying he would close. But we assume that he did not indeed close his saloon on Sundays because it was the most popular day. And newspapers described how saloon keepers would close their front doors and open the back doors. And so these rear staircases became very important for people to access the saloons. Another German family we talk about is that of Natalie and Julius Gumpertz. This is their kitchen that's been recreated to about 1873, 1874. Natalie and Julius had come from Prussia, met in Klein-Deutschland and married, and by 1870 are living in our building with 2 children. A few years later, 1874, they'll have 2 more children. And the main story that we tell here is that one morning Julius woke up, he went to work as a cobbler, and he didn't return from work that night. And so Natalie goes actually down to the saloon and enlists the help of John Schneider, and she enlists the help of Lucas Glockner, the landlord, and they look for Julius, but alas, he was not found. And so the story then becomes, what does Natalie do, a mother with 4 children? How is she going to maintain her existence? And she goes to work actually as a dressmaker, and she sews clothes. And we know this story because in 1883, Julius's father passed away, leaving him an inheritance of $600, the equivalent of about 5 years of rent. And in order to access this money, Natalie had to go to court and prove that Julius was no longer with her. And she then had the help of John Schneider and Lucas Glockner in doing that. And is able to move uptown. The museum later found that Julius took off and went to Cincinnati, Ohio. Yes. But the story that we tell at the museum is about, her resilience, what she does. And this is something we found later, that even before Julius left, they were on the charity rolls of the United Hebrew Charities, an organization that gave help. And so it speaks to the kind of precariousness of these families who are living in the tenements, that even with her husband there making money, or as someone who is eligible to work or could work, there were moments even before he left where they were in trouble. And this whole book, the whole ledger, gives us all sorts of accounts of when it is that people needed help and when it was that they were deemed worthy of assistance. The reason why this is so important to modern day audiences or visitors is that sometimes people come with this idea that immigrants of the past worked hard and they didn't need help. And the story we tell with Natalie is that she worked hard, but she did need help, and that doing well in this country it often required the help of the community. It required the help of your neighbors, and it required the help, in some cases, of charity. And that becomes an important thing for some of our visitors to think about. This is another story, an Italian story. This is before and after the restoration of this particular apartment. But the Baldizzi family came from Sicily in the 1920s. We know their story due to documents, but we also know their story because their daughter, Josephine, showed up at the museum early on when it opened, and she said, I lived in this building, at which point the founders of the museum said, "You are the Messiah, sit down," and tell us about what it was like. And so that in this kitchen, Josephine, you hear Josephine's voice describing the kitchen, describing her mother, describing her father, and it's a really powerful moment to kind of just stand in this kitchen. And if you can see on the right side, the cupboard that's there, the cabinet was made by her father, who was a carpenter, but was out of work during the Depression. And so she tells that story as well. One of the things that we've been playing with recently in our telling of this story is the story of Rosaria, her mother, who arrives in the country in 1925. And this is significant because her husband, Adolfo, came in 1923. And in 1924, there are important law was passed, the Johnson-Reed Act, that severely restricted immigration to the United States. It was really the first time that European immigration is restricted to the United States. There had been a Chinese Exclusion Act before that, but in 1924, this law is passed that really makes it difficult to come to the country, especially if you're from Eastern Europe or from Southern Europe. And so Rosaria, being from Southern Europe, it's very difficult for her to get here. And we know, we were able to find Adolfo on the Ellis Island list, but not Rosaria. But yet we found out that in 1948 she becomes a citizen. So how was it that an undocumented immigrant was able to become a citizen? Well, we found these documents that showed that in 1945 she crossed the border to Canada and was able to then enter the country. There was something called pre-examination, which was established by Frances Perkins, who was a leader in the progressive movement and became the first woman to serve in a cabinet. And she was the Secretary of Labor. And at that time, immigration fell under the portfolio of labor. And she knew that there were so many European immigrants who came after 1924, who were smuggled into the country. And she argued that now they're part of families, they're part of communities, they should be able to become citizens, and basically crafted this elaborate program where people were able to go to Canada and then come back again. And we know that Rosaria took part in that. Of course, given the debates in my country now about documented immigrants and amnesty, these issues become really important. And I think the beauty of our museum is that you're standing first, you get to meet Rosaria Baldizzi before you learn that she's an undocumented immigrant. And you hear about her from her daughter and her son, who would later serve in World War II as a soldier. This story becomes something different than if we were just to bring people into a room and say, let's talk about the undocumented immigrants today, right? You're bringing people into a story of a family. The Rogoshevsky family left Lithuania, Telš, Lithuania in 1901 and came to New York. Abraham Rogoshevsky, the patriarch, his wife Fanny, and we tell their story, and we focus on how this family worked and made a living. The children worked in the garment industry. The father did as well. But given his attachment to his religion, he was an observant Jew, he didn't want to work on Saturday. And a lot of the jobs that were available after the turn of the 20th century required Saturday work. So it looks as if his children worked on that day, but he didn't. And so this tour allows us to talk about how families negotiate change. How do economics clash or come together with or mesh with culture? And so we talk about the Friday night Sabbath in this case, but we also talk about the changes that occurred in the Saturday Sabbath. And that brings up all sorts of connections to our school children who visit, some of whom are the children of Chinese immigrants, some of whom are the children of Bangladeshi immigrants, and they share the ways in which their families are reconciling cultural change as well. So Fanny Rogoshevsky would have no idea that her kitchen would become this place where all of these people from all around the world who have now come to New York are talking about their own cultural adaptation. So I would say that cultural adaptation is a theme that comes up not just in the Rogoshevsky apartment, but many of the tours that we do. So moving on to the new building, this is a building of 103 Orchard Street taken in 1940. Now, because of that 1924 immigration law that I mentioned earlier, the Lower East Side, for the first time, has a population decline. So throughout the 19th century, as immigrants arrived, the population of the Lower East Side grew and grew and grew. And it wasn't as if immigrants stayed on the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side, for many of these people, was a stopping place. You're going to stay there a few years, get settled, make money, and then once the subways are built, and especially once the bridges are built, move to the promised land of Brooklyn, or take the subway to the Bronx, but get out of Manhattan and the Lower East Side. But those waves of immigrants were always replenished by new waves arriving until this 1924 law, which really choked off immigration. And so the Lower East Side, for the first time, has a population decline. Yet, there are still newcomers arriving. They're coming in the 40s and 50s from some of the same places and also new places as well. So many of the Italian immigrants and the Jewish immigrants who had come from Eastern Europe worked in the garment industry in New York. Once that law was passed, there were no new immigrants arriving. The garment industry still needs workers. So this starts a wave of Puerto Rican migration, which is fascinating because Puerto Rico is part of the United States. These are United States citizens arriving, but yet when they get here, they're dealing with some of the same dynamics and issues that Italians and Jews had dealt with in the past in terms of adapting to a new city and a new language. So we have a Puerto Rican migration. We also have, in the late 1940s, a wave of refugees coming who were actually coming from displaced persons camps in Germany. These were survivors of World War II and the Holocaust. And so many of them were attracted to the Lower East Side because there was a network and a system of kosher butchers and synagogues and bakeries, all of the services and the schools and the community that they needed. So that's another new wave of population in the late 40s. And after 1965, it will also be a main attraction for Chinese immigrants arriving. So these are the new stories we'll be telling in this building. Even though I just talked about separate waves of migration, I think what is most fascinating for us now in planning this exhibit is thinking about how these groups interacted. They all overlapped. So it wasn't as if, 1947 and 1949, you have the refugees and then 50 to 60 the Puerto Ricans and 60 to 70 the Chinese. No, they're overlapping. And so what we want to imagine here in hallways and in staircases are the spaces in which these various groups are interacting with one another. They're not viewing each other as refugees or as migrants or as immigrants. They're viewing each other as neighbors, as mothers, as fathers, as garment workers. So what are the kinds of conversations that are here? The academic term that we draw on often is commonplace cosmopolitanism, and this term is a term sociologists have used to study neighborhoods in London and elsewhere, but it's one we're trying to kind of understand the Lower East Side as it was becoming, in this time period, actually one of the most diverse neighborhoods in New York. This is actually the hand of Bella Epstein, and this is the apartment we're now in the process of recreating. There's construction going on. But this picture of her hand, and it's not just of her hand, you'll see her whole body in just a moment, but she recognizes in apartment 7 where she lived, the mezuzah, or the parchment that's encased and is supposed to be affixed to the homes of Jews, and she recognized that was the one that her parents had put up 60 years before. And she said it was brave of her parents to do that because they had been persecuted for their religion. They both had been in concentration camps and both had lost most of their families, but now they come to this new country and they put the mezuzah up on the door, which is a testament as well, not just to their faith, but to their, I think, their belief or the safety they felt in this new country. And these are the forms. This is Regina Epstein and Polland Epstein. They were able to come to the United States as part of a presidential executive order. Congress did not want to pass any laws that changed the immigration laws and the quotas that were on the books, in part because a Gallup poll taken in 1945 showed that only 5% of Americans thought immigration laws should be changed. They were worried about the economy, they were worried about many, many things. And so Truman knew that to start allowing refugees to come, he needed to use an executive order, which they were some of the lucky refugees who were able to take advantage of that. By 1948, Congress would pass the Displaced Persons and Refugee Act, which would allow about 400,000 people to come, which is significant because it's the first time in U.S. law that they're able to use it. I'm just going to show, we have to wrap up, but I will show a video. This is Bella and her sister Bluma, and just so you can see her.
Children of immigrants are sometimes between two cultures. And sometimes that really is an advantage to be culturally bilingual, if you will.
My father bought a record player that he used to play Yossel Rosenblatt albums on. And he would say, oh, a Stimme, that means a voice, what a voice he has, what a voice he has. And then when my father wasn't using the record player, I had gotten my mother to buy me a record, and it was Polland. Oh, please stay by me, Diana.
I'm so young and you're so old.
That was the song. I mean, that was it. That made me an American.
Just what they say.
And it's interesting, right? Because she's born on the Lower East Side. She's born in America, but it's the pop culture, it's the music that makes her feel an American. And this is a theme that we hear with the other immigrant families that we're depicting. And again, because of shortness of time, I'm just going to play one more video to give you a sense of these families. Very quickly, that's Jose Velez, a Puerto Rican migrant who came. This is his third grade class at PS42, and you can see how the Lower East Side is becoming a diverse neighborhood. Once again, you have Chinese students, African American students, Puerto Rican students, Jewish and Italian students. This is his mother, Ramonita, who worked in the garment shop. You know, we all are going to do our hair like that. I was able to learn it was a wig that she would add to her hair, so it wasn't always perfect, but she was able to get that done. And this is just a drawing of the sketch of the parlor, of the front room we'll be recreating. And this is Jose, and then the Wong family is here, and I'm going to play this as a video so you can see that. Not able to, I can't find where my finger is. Oh, there. Okay, sorry. I know where that. I'm sorry. I just want to click. There should be, my hand is not. There should be, if you hover above the. Sorry.
My mom came to the United States in 1965. She wanted a better life for her kids.
帶我個女啊，入兵啊，嚟啊，仲有一方啊，啱出咗世嘅時啊，係啊，因為我拎緊好重啊嘛，嗰陣時啊，又孭一次我方啦，又有啲碗啊，又有個影相機啊，我又孭一次啊，咁啊，有好多月餅啊，嗰陣時啊8月15咯，咁咧就咁我哎呀重得滯咯，好似人咩，好似人咩個電飯煲好似，樣啲碗啊好重啊，總之好重啊！我同我女講，有得重得滯咯，我唔拎咯，掉咗佢咯。身邊我女佢話：啊媽咪啊，等我拎啦，唔好掉。We came from Hong Kong on an airplane, and it was, it was a bit of a shock, I guess, to come to a place that was all Chinese back in Hong Kong where I grew up, and then to a place now there are like people with strange looking faces, and to a new apartment and new school, and so there was a lot of adjustment for me to come.
And so one of the issues that has come up with all the families is English and learning English and how that happens, but also the role of children in immigration in terms of how the children are often helping the parents and how that plays out in the family. So I'm so over time, and I apologize for that, but I'm happy to answer questions later about these stories. There are so many issues that they pose. Thank you.